If you like this video, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Link in the description below.
Greetings, mortals, and Happy New Year. I know I'm a few months off, but please, cut me some slack. I've been very busy. You know, vampire mistress things. The Human uploaded a video last month, so there's that. Anyway, on to the subject. RWBY, spelled RWBY, is an online web cartoon heavily inspired by action-oriented anime created by Monty Oum, may he rest in peace, and produced by Rooster Teeth. The series started in 2013 and is still ongoing to this day. RWBY Grimm Eclipse is interesting, as it started out as a fan game, developed by Jordan Scott in only about 4 months to celebrate Rooster Teeth's anniversary in 2014. He created a demo for a RWBY fan game that shared this title. Now, the Grimm Eclipse from 2014 was based on the Red trailer, which, for those of you who don't know, was the first of the 4 trailers that were released before the proper series began. This fan game, honestly, looks badass. But unfortunately, Jordan had to remove its download link when Rooster Teeth hired him to turn Grimm Eclipse into a full game. From the looks of this footage, the game looks rad enough. Stuff like the lock-on feature, the command menu in the bottom left, enemy health bars in the top right, and RWBY's health being at the bottom right, all scream to me that he was inspired by Kingdom Hearts when designing the UI, and I approve of that decision heavily. It makes sense to adapt RWBY into an action game, honestly. RWBY, especially the first 3 volumes, was best known for stylish character designs and rule of cool over-the-top action sequences, which, honestly, was creator Monty Oum's specialty, as seen in his earlier works like Dead Fantasy and Haloid. When RWBY first dropped in 2013, I was honestly really big on that series and adored it, but I fell off after Volume 4 left me feeling unsatisfied. Without spoiling anything, Volume 3's ending left a lot of questions open for the future of the series, and Volume 4 left me feeling like I was still waiting for the payoff to all that, in a way that made me just lose interest in the show. Now, RWBY is 8 volumes in, with a 9th one currently airing at the time of recording, alongside multiple novels, a manga, an actual anime in Ice Kingdom, a crossover comic with DC, which is also getting an animated adaptation, another DC crossover, and alongside all of that, Team RWBY, as well as Neo, being present within the roster of BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle, alongside multiple other franchises like BlazBlue, Persona 4, Under Night in Birth, and Senran Kagura, among a few others. Arrowfell is a more recent RWBY game, but it, like Grimm Eclipse, is canon. But Arrowfell takes place several volumes after, and long after I stopped watching, so I don't feel well equipped to tackle that game. Grimm Eclipse, meanwhile, takes place between volumes 2 and 3 and is canon as previously stated. The official Grimm Eclipse, not the fan game, was initially released early access on Steam in 2015 before properly releasing in 2016. In July of that year for Windows, and then October the same year for Mac users, so even Scott the Woz can play it if he ever wanted to, which I doubt. In 2017, the game would come to PS4 and Xbox One, and finally, in 2021, it would unexpectedly come to Nintendo Switch, including a brand new couch co-op mode, and bringing along a few new costume packs for Team RWBY, including the designs for the Atlas arc. These extra costumes were made DLC for the other versions. I assume, anyway. I know they were made DLC for the PC version, which is the version I'm playing for this video, so I assume they were made DLC for the console versions as well, but I could be wrong. With all that introduction stuff out of the way, I can now get into the actual game and talk about it. So Grimm Eclipse, as you probably figured, is a 3D action game that I feel would be best described as a 3D beat-em-up, something similar to Shredder's Revenge or Streets of Rage. The combat is simple and not very complex, with your typical light and heavy attack buttons and the X and Y buttons, alongside a Batman Arkham-style counter with the B button that you hit when it appears above an enemy. There's also the finishing move, done when the RB button appears above an enemy, and the dodge button with LB. Also, frustratingly, the ultimate attack of each character is activated with the LB and RB buttons being hit at the same time, and the game likes to misread this action as me just trying to dodge, which is annoying. When you level up, you hear a guitar riff of This Will Be the Day, i.e. Volume 1's opening, and be prompted to hit the D-pad to open the menu. But it literally does not work. I do not know if there's a bug fix for this. I doubt it, given how few people play this game to my knowledge, especially currently. But I'm basically required to hit the C key on my keyboard to open this menu instead. because the controller alternative just doesn't work, despite every other button on my controller working. I don't know why it's like this. I don't get it. The combat, like I mentioned earlier, is simple, and if I'm being completely honest, it isn't very mechanically engaging. You should not go into this game expecting something deep and interesting like Devil May Cry or Kingdom Hearts. It does not have the depth to even compare to those titles. Now, the simple nature of the combat by itself is not a problem, especially if it's executed well enough or if there's enough other qualities to make up for that. If this game makes up for that is... In the game, you have 4 playable characters, those being Ruby Rose, Weiss Schnee, Blake Belladonna, and Yang Xiaolong. These 4 make up the titular team RWBY, with their names making up the title of their team and the series as a whole. If you get the DLC, then you also get access to Team Juniper, but I don't have the DLC, and I really don't want to spend an additional $5 just to see what they play like. Especially when you take into account I spent $20 on this game by itself, and personally the main 4 characters don't feel different enough to play for me to justify the additional $5, no matter how much fun Nora is as a character or how fucking cool Rin is. This isn't to say Ruby, Weiss, Yang, and Blake don't have their own movesets, because they do. But despite that, despite these different character animations and whatnot, they all just feel so very samey to control. All 4 of them have ultimate moves that are AoE attacks, all 4 of them have light attacks that you can combo into heavy attacks very simplistically. They don't feel like the exact same character. Weiss is using a rapier as her main weapon, so she definitely feels different than Ruby, who uses a scythe that's also a gun, or Yang, who fights with her fist, which are armed with gauntlets that are also guns. Yeah, you're going to want to get used to the idea of weapons being also a gun, by the way. Pretty common in the world of RWBY, actually. That's besides the point, though. What I'm trying to say is, while the characters move differently and have a bit of a difference in, like, animations and stuff, I didn't feel a big difference between them. I made a point to try and play every character to get a decent feel for how they played, and doing so has basically made me lose any interest I ever could have had in buying the Juniper DLC, because I doubt very seriously that these 4 would feel much different to control despite their distinctly different weapons and in-universe fighting styles. It's perplexing to me. I don't know how this happened. Like, maybe I'm missing something, but how can these characters have different animations in their combat, different weapon styles, and like slightly feel different in that regard, but then playing all 4 of them still feels so samey? I don't have a reason to choose Yang over Blake or Weiss over Ruby outside of what character I prefer to play. The playable characters have different movesets, but they all feel the same to control. For example, take something like Devil May Cry 5, which is a game that came out years later, I know, but I can still use it for this point. That game has 3 playable characters in its base game, those being Nero, Dante, and mysterious newcomer V. Each character sharing some similar button commands, but feeling distinctly different to control from one another. Each played similar enough that your overall skills at the game could consistently help you with each, but the overall movesets were unique to them. Playing Dante in that game is an overall vastly different gameplay experience than playing Nero or V, and this is an example of what I mean when I said that Grimm Eclipse isn't as deep or interesting gameplay-wise as other action games. I meant it earlier when I compared it more to an arcade beat-em-up, with you selecting a character and going from level to level with nothing else really going on in the game, aside from you going from point A to point B, while fighting waves of enemies without much else to offer. I am not kidding, by the way. Fighting is basically all you do in this game. The first level, in that regard, is actually a pretty good introduction to this game. Starting the first level, the game immediately drops you into gameplay without any story setup or cutscene, as the game lacks any real cutscenes to speak of, and your first job is to fight some Grimm to release the invisible wall that will allow yourself to move forward, or you then fight some more Grimm to release another invisible wall, and then you find a control center inside a cave, which you now have to defend from waves of enemies before the level ends. Yeah. Safe to say this game could have desperately used with a deeper combat system, because the one on offer is nowhere near good enough to validate having so much of the gameplay be combat. I know I shouldn't keep bringing up Devil May Cry. I know it's unfair, and we really shouldn't compare every single action game to Devil May Cry, because different action games are going for different things, and that's valid and makes sense and can work out really well. But Devil May Cry has a very in-depth and satisfying combat system with a varied toolkit that allows you, the player, freedom to weave combos into one another in creative and stylish ways. The game's even motivating you, the player, to try riskier combos and to put yourself into danger for great reward with the style meter. To me personally, if you're going to make your game fighting and fighting alone, then the combat on offer has to be strong enough to support that decision. But if it isn't, well then, let me use a non-DMC example so people don't think I want this to be a DMC-flavored RWBY game. The original No More Heroes is a game with fairly simple combat, and if it was solely the combat sections back-to-back with nothing else, then I could 100% understand someone feeling like it was repetitive and not very entertaining on its own. Which is why I think it was a smart decision on Grasshopper's part to have each main combat level of No More Heroes 1 broken up with the parts in Santa Destroy where you, as Travis, have to earn the money to pay your fee for your next mission by doing jobs, which come in the form of mini-games. And yes, there are combat jobs, but they aren't your only option. The point I'm making here is the jobs help with No More Heroes 1's pacing. Grimm Eclipse doesn't have anything like that. It's just level after level of beating the shit out of dudes with its simple combat until credits, and that by itself grows exceptionally dull because there's nothing to explore within the toolkits and nothing to get good at. You know your character's entire toolkit within the first 5 minutes of this game, and since every character basically feels the same, despite technically having different movesets and fighting styles, there's nothing really new to learn and nothing to play with. You could try exploring the levels to see what secrets you can find to try and break it up a little, but you'll be sorely disappointed because these levels have more invisible walls than Sue and Reed's bedroom after a marital dispute and are about as open to explore as a restroom at Denny's. I've got to be honest, playing this game in single player is very boring and not super fun. It grows stale very quickly alone, especially once you realize every single combo in this game is just hit X until you hit Y, which is as basic as a combat system can get, and mix that with bland environments and you get an honestly very dull experience. Don't get me started on the final boss, which was a goddamn slog, even with 3 other players backing me up. The thing didn't feel like it was reacting to attacks at all, and it felt like it took forever to finally take it down. It doesn't help that this is the only real boss in the entire game, and it's the last one. And it's just a mutated Deathstalker, which is the same kind of Grimm Team RWBY fought alongside Team Juniper against in Volume 1 of the show. Speaking of having other players, do not play this game in single player. I mentioned earlier, it is boring as sin. I am begging you not to do that to yourself. If you're just that into RWBY and need to play this game, play it in multiplayer. The game seems to agree with me since, in single player, the only mode you can engage with is the campaign, while other modes like Horde mode are exclusive to the multiplayer. The only issue is, nobody's playing this game, and the only way you're playing the multiplayer is if you actively set it up by finding 3 other people willing to play RWBY Grimm Eclipse with you in current year, who all happen to either already own the game or are willing to drop $20 on your ass so they can play a game like this just so you don't have to be alone. There is an option to just join a random public lobby, but like I said, nobody's playing this game right now. I imagine the game may have had a bit of player boost during 2021 when the Switch release dropped, but now it's basically a ghost town in here.
Can I help you? I wish you could, mate.
I'm glad at least I knew some people who conveniently were looking for another player for their own group, and I jumped at the chance so I could get a feel for this game's multiplayer. I will say, the game is definitely more fun with other people, and it feels clear to me that this game was designed with the multiplayer first. Not just because the basic combat and repetitive gameplay loop is more enjoyable with others, even if just barely, but also because character voice lines always talk as if the entire team is there, even if you're in single player, which is awkward.
Well, what are we waiting for? Get it? Guys?
Shut the fuck up.
Speaking of the voice lines, it's insane to me that this game's audio balancing is so mixed and inconsistent. I know these videos aren't exactly perfect at audio mixing either, but the difference is I'm a Z-list YouTube personality who talks about video games, and this is a commercial product released by a fairly well-known company. Anyway, back on point, a handful of times I couldn't hear the characters over the music, especially Professor Oobleck, who I swear is quieter than every other character in this game. There was also an odd moment where Oobleck's line got cut off for a moment, and then he continued on like he didn't just go quiet for a few seconds there. It was like the phone call cut out for a moment, like he was using Discord Mobile or something, which I guess, points for realism and simulating an actual phone call, but I doubt very seriously this wasn't just a glitch and was instead some intentional bout of realism in the faux anime game where I got stuck on small pieces of geometry in the environment, specifically in level 3. But hey, the game may not look super great, and the gameplay might be a slog, and the audio balancing might be bad, and the music might be kind of generic when it isn't just taken straight from the show, but what about the story? I mean, after all, this game is canon to the show, and takes place between volumes 2 and 3 of RWBY, so like, what about that? Well, sadly, this game doesn't really add anything to the story of RWBY. And it feels more like one of those Naruto movies, where the events happen outside of the main show, but they can't really fuck with anything too much since they aren't meant to be canon, but they still want you to see them. The difference is, this is meant to be canon, so the fact that it feels like that feels wrong. I assume the idea was to make the story plausible in canon, but also be able to be ignored if someone watching the show didn't play the game, and I guess that's fine, but I would have preferred something with a little more impact and weight. At least something. The game starts with Team RWBY being sent on a mission to the Emerald Forest because there's been issues with the security network. Once they get there, they discover someone intentionally tampered with the device, and after a defense mission to end level 1, the party moves on to another beacon. Beacon. Get it? It's like the school? Anyway, they do the same thing in level 2, but this time notice cages that seem to imply whoever's doing this is trying to capture Grimm. These cages were also made by Merlot Industries, something Peter Port, i.e. the guy with the mustache the girls were talking over the phone with in the beginning levels, notices after finally remembering where he had seen the symbol before, since his brain apparently runs on dial-up. They're informed that Merlot Industries had its primary facility located in Mountain Glen, which is the location from the show the girls went to in Volume 2. So they head there next, now being guided by Oobleck instead of Peter, Oobleck being the guy who was also their escort during their initial time there in Volume 2. Eventually, after fighting more Grimm, since that's basically all the level consists of, which, like I said before, would be more fun if the combat didn't have the same amount of depth as the writing in Saints Row 4, but boom! An enormous explosion causes the building to collapse around them, and then the team find themselves plunging down harder than Sonic Boom's TV ratings, which causes them to land in the underground ruins of the city, which they find has a small little problem of a ticking time bomb that's going to go off in a few minutes and will blow up, taking them all along with it.
Blows up!
The team manages to stop the blast from taking them all out by dropping it into a massive fucking chasm before they escape. Back above ground, the girls then go to Forever Fall. You may be pogging and soy-jacking at the screen right now looking at this level, and yes, this is the same red-ass forest from the Black trailer. And I thought that was pretty cool myself, not gonna lie. Unfortunately, not much happens here. The girls open a few doors using ruins they find through breaking pots, do more fighting, surprise surprise, and find more signs of Merlot's bullshit. Eventually, the girls stow away on a boat like Miguel and Tulio in the GOAT Road to El Dorado and find themselves on a remote island which is, you guessed it, connected to Merlot. At this point, Merlot decides to dial up the girls and taunts them directly. This is when sexy anime man who would never hide anything, ever, Professor Ozpin, shows up and begins talking to Merlot himself, which reveals he already knows this man. The only thing that comes from this revelation is Ozpin explaining it's Merlot's fault that Glen is in the state that it is now, because he had been experimenting on and researching Grimm, but started running out of subjects, so he started attracting them to the city, thus destroying it. So yeah, this is the most interesting piece of story this game ever presents. I want to give it some credit for that, at least, but like, that's literally it. Anyway, the girls find some mutagen and figure it's the stuff Merlot's using to make his mutant Grimm, so they follow its trail to his lab. Here is when the game decides to up its stakes, because now we're not just fighting Grimm, but mutated Grimm, and also robot foot soldiers as well. All of which, admittedly, do have decently cool designs. At the end, there's one final gauntlet of enemies before Merlot unleashes his giant enemy Scorpion.
So here's this giant enemy crab.
Which, as I explained earlier, is not fun to fight, but is honestly the most fitting way for this game to end if you ask me, since most of this game isn't fun either. Once you defeat the final boss, Merlot decides to throw his hands in the air and hit the self-destruct button to blow up his lab with Team RWBY inside it. Thankfully, Ozpin called the girls an airship in the floor escape, leaving Merlot's lab to explode without them in it, and damning him to the world of never appearing in the show proper, but depending on who you ask, that might not be such a bad fate after all. And with that, RWBY Grimm Eclipse ends. And boy, fucking howdy, did I not enjoy this experience. The game only took me a little over 4 hours to finish, but that's only because I did play some levels more than once. So I can't imagine how much shorter this game is if you just did one solid run of the game with no interruptions or anything like that. And no, I'm not saying it being short is a problem. A short game by itself is not an issue. This game's problem, however, is that it isn't fun to play. And despite only being around 4 hours, it was the slowest 4 hours of my fucking life. And I've been alive for a really, really long time. I don't take much joy in saying this, but this game fucking sucks. It's not very fun or satisfying to play. The story doesn't really do anything for me, nor does it really add anything to the greater world of RWBY, so there's nothing to grab onto there. It doesn't look great visually, and it's really only tolerable in multiplayer, because in single player all of its worst qualities are made even worse. If you're not a fan of RWBY, don't even bother with this one. And if you are a fan of RWBY, then you still shouldn't bother because you're not going to get anything out of this game. And that's depressing. Considering this started as a fan game and then got picked up to be developed as a full official title that connected canonically to the show itself, the fact that that ended up like this, in my opinion, is a shame. It's funny though. My feelings about this game reflect my feelings on RWBY as a whole. Like I said, when RWBY first came out in 2013, I loved it and was borderline obsessed with all of it. It's badass music, it's gorgeous fights animated by the late great Monty Oum, and it's cool as fuck character designs. They truly excited me, even if, in hindsight, the story was never something too spectacular, and it rarely ever outdid anything else, including anime airing around the same time. But after Volume 4 hit, something changed, and what was once something I really, really liked lost its spark. So I stopped watching RWBY and left it behind me. I have no interest in ever picking it back up. This game definitely didn't convince me of that either. And especially not now that we're on Volume 9. And that would take so much time when I have other things I'd rather be spending my time watching, playing, or reading. Grimm Eclipse should have been a game full of charm. But unfortunately, even brilliant lights can cease to burn. And this one certainly did. Nothing really more to say after that.